Throughout the 1990s, Blizzard Entertainment had risen from unlikely startup to the most powerful force in PC gaming. Early successes with their Warcraft and Diablo games had led to even more successful sequels. After a rough start, their StarCraft game had turned into one of the legends of the art form. Since 1995, every single game they had released sold 1 million units or more, and the numbers were rising with every year. They had complete creative and financial freedom. They could do whatever they wanted, make games as wild and diverse as they felt like. But for a variety of reasons, the early 2000s saw a series of failed developments and major resignations, and in the end, only 2 games from their established Warcraft franchise would see the light of day. But as it happened, those 2 games became some of the most respected, influential, and successful games of all time. Even when things looked at their worst, the Blizzard reputation shined through. After finishing StarCraft Brood War in November 1998, Blizzard's main team in Irvine, California split into 2. While one went to work on the studio's next real-time strategy game, Warcraft 3, the other began work on a brand new IP, a sci-fi role-playing game called Nomad. Sadly, the Nomad project never really got off the ground, and eventually, it was shuttered before even being announced. Which meant that the team had to find something else to do. However, the company's other studio, Blizzard North, was on a roll. After completing Diablo 2 in 2000, they went on to do the expansion pack themselves. Previously, nearly all Blizzard expansions had been done by third parties. But starting with Brood War, Blizzard started doing all their expansions internally by the same teams that had made the core game. The strategy worked again, as Lord of Destruction went on to be a success after its release in June 2001. Immediately after that, Blizzard North began rolling on Diablo 3. Unlike the uncertainty of their southern cousins, who had met failures with both the adventure game Warcraft Adventures and the Nomad project, the northern studio seemed to be in complete control. Little did they know that they would never release a game again. In September 2001, Blizzard announced a new game. It was the follow-up project for the Nomad team. A good number of those guys had been playing massively multiplayer online games, or MMOs for short.
As the Nomad project was progressing and it wasn't really shaping up, we decided to change direction for the team. They wanted to work on an MMO. We talked about what franchise made sense, whether we should do a new world or if we should try to leverage one of the existing worlds. And when we looked at the Warcraft franchise, we really felt like it just seemed like the right fit.
The result would be World of Warcraft. However, in typical Blizzard fashion, no release date was given and the game wouldn't be seen for years as the team tried to make it just right. In the meantime, the southern studio was finishing up the other Warcraft game. Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos released in July 2002, a vastly changed beast from the original concept. Its 6 promised races had been reduced to 4, its much-hyped heroes were now just powerful units instead of the player's own character. It was, in other words, a standard traditional RTS, with the heroes just adding in some extra flavor. However, it was still a leap forward in several respects. For one thing, it was Blizzard's first fully 3D game, although that didn't impact gameplay too much in this case. For another, the quality of the studio's pre-rendered cutscenes reached a whole new level. These allowed the team to flesh out the narrative into a sweeping epic that nevertheless stayed focused on its characters, making for the most story-driven strategy game to date. Complementing the writing was Blizzard's trademark balanced gameplay and completely different factions. When all combined, the end result was a game that is to this day considered one of the finest strategy titles ever made. As with StarCraft before it, it went on to be a staple of professional gaming tournaments worldwide. It should be no surprise that the game was followed by an expansion pack, 2003's The Frozen Throne. As with Diablo 2's expansion, this one would be made by the same team that made the core game, ensuring that it would keep the same tone while living up to the same standards of quality. The result was almost a whole new game, with another huge story and new units for multiplayer. So now all 3 of Blizzard's major franchises were rolling on new projects. Blizzard North had Diablo 3 in development, Blizzard's southern base had World of Warcraft and a sequel to StarCraft in development, and another developer, Nihilistic Software, had a brand new StarCraft game in the works. Begun in 2002 for a 2003 release, StarCraft Ghost was to be a third-person action game for consoles. Blizzard hadn't made a game specifically for consoles since 1995, but this game was perfectly suited for that format. It would follow an elite human operative within the broader StarCraft narrative, and the reaction from fans was fantastic. Over the years, many screenshots, trailers, and articles would be released. What wouldn't release was an actual game. In true Blizzard fashion, it was delayed and overhauled again and again. As if the Ghost team's problems weren't enough, in June 2003, the leaders of the Diablo project left Blizzard North. Those guys had originally founded their own studio, Condor, only to be bought out and absorbed into Blizzard, which was itself owned by a larger corporation. Feeling like they weren't involved with the big decisions anymore, and unable to guarantee their own employees' compensations and futures, the Blizzard North executives protested. They even went so far as to tender their resignations unless they were heard. Unfortunately, those resignations were accepted. The Diablo team lost their leaders, a blow they would never recover from. Not to be outdone, in January 2004, the original Blizzard team lost their own leader. When Alan Adham had graduated from college, he whipped up a plan to start his own game company on his own terms. 13 years later, he chose to leave it behind. He stated that the long hours and high stress had finally gotten to him, and he now wished to pursue a career in finance. His co-founder Mike Morheim had already taken over as president, so the company didn't undergo any major changes with his departure. Then later that same year, Blizzard dropped Nihilistic Software as developer of StarCraft Ghost, which was still in production with no end in sight. However, the Irvine crew still believed in the project and brought in Swingin' Ape Studios to take control. Swingin' Ape would eventually be acquired by Blizzard outright and would be rebranded as Blizzard Console. From then on, nothing associated with Blizzard would be made by anyone but Blizzard. So they got to work on StarCraft Ghost. Once again, it failed to release. Meanwhile, Blizzard's own StarCraft game, the direct sequel StarCraft 2, was nowhere near completion. With all these troubles and resignations piling up on top of each other, some began to say that Blizzard's reign at the top had ended. Then in November 2004, 10 years after the original Warcraft released, World of Warcraft came out. In development for 4 years, it was the single largest and most expensive project in the company's history to date. If it didn't succeed, it might just be the final nail in the coffin. But Blizzard put their faith in the game and hoped that they'd be able to sell 400,000 copies of the game in its first year on store shelves.
We had what by today's standards seemed like some very modest goals for ourselves. We had hardware infrastructure in North America to support about around 400,000 or 500,000 active subscribers, which we felt like if we achieved that in North America, we'd be successful and we could operate a successful business around the World of Warcraft game.
It sold that many in its first month. The MMO genre was still coming into its own. Entirely online with thousands of gamers all playing in one massive world, it was considered a niche market, with little presence in major territories like Europe. World of Warcraft blew those preconceptions away by becoming a global runaway success. One of the advantages of the genre was that it allowed the studio to charge a monthly subscription to play the game. This was necessary to offset the costs of making and maintaining the world. But the rates had been geared for profitability with a few 100,000 subscribers. Less than a year later, World of Warcraft had 4 million subscribers. These were unprecedented numbers. And with each one of them paying a monthly fee, it meant unprecedented revenue for a single game. Naysayers had said Blizzard was in trouble. Warcraft proved them wrong. Over the years, the popularity of the game only grew. Expansion packs made internally by the core Warcraft team would each become the fastest-selling PC title in history upon release. The subscriber base cleared 6 million, 8 million, 10 million, and has currently grown to 12 million paying customers. For one thing, this means the game has sold at least 12 million copies. But considering that a good number of players probably bought the game and then stopped subscribing at some point, the actual number of sales is likely much higher. For another, when all the various subscription fees around the world are tallied up, this means that the game earns roughly $1 billion per year in subscriptions alone. There has never been anything like it in the history of the medium. What made it so popular? As with other Blizzard products, there was nothing in the game that was truly brand new. It adhered closely to established MMO conventions, being a fantasy role-playing experience based on leveling up character stats and collecting items. But as with other Blizzard products, everything had been polished to perfection. Everything just worked intuitively, or if it didn't, it was quickly changed by Blizzard's balancing team. The art design was vibrant and accessible. The combat was considered the best in MMO history. And of course, the already golden name of Warcraft drew in a huge crowd from the get-go. All in all, World of Warcraft is yet another legend from a company that has already exceeded its quota for legendary games. Already at the peak of its industry, Blizzard had vaulted to heights few, if any, other game makers have ever reached. And with the windfall of profits from the game, Blizzard could now grow their company dramatically. Of course, they still had to continually support Warcraft, and this occasionally led to some issues. For all the success of their MMO juggernaut, it didn't help with any of their other projects.
We had to prioritize supporting the World of Warcraft community really above all else, especially in the early days of launching WoW. I think we almost certainly would have been able to finish StarCraft 2 faster if it weren't for the runaway success of WoW.
StarCraft 2, Diablo 3, and StarCraft Ghost were all trapped in development hell. And before any of them would see the light of day, the empire of Blizzard's many studios would collapse. Tune in next time to see Blizzard consolidate and then dominate.
They came from different places, different worlds, but they all came with the same purpose: to fight.